Thank you, friends. It's good to be with you. The gathering is special in part because it is a community, a spiritual community that together we create. Thank you to the clerks and members of Long Range Conference Planning Committee who have care of the gathering, to FGC staff and especially gathering staff who have worked so hard and long, to our technical staff, and to all of you who are volunteering to facilitate workshops, worship sharing, interest groups, and more. Let's show thanks for all these amazing people. I also want to say a special thank you to Patsy Arnold Martin, Tony Martin, and Barbara Von Salas, the co-clerks of this gathering. They have done amazing work for us all while navigating numerous obstacles. Thank you. Your grace and faithfulness is seen and appreciated. As our co-clerks shared last night, Way Will Open is a beautiful theme for this year's gathering. These words, when said aloud, have always felt inherently hopeful and reassuring to me. Yet the spiritual meaning of this old Quaker saying can be much deeper than an expression of reassurance. When God lays something on your heart that requires an action, being told, "Way will open," can affirm that you are called, and that though you may not know the path to fulfill this call, you will do it anyway. Surrender your worries unto God. Trust that your faithfulness and diligence, that the path will become clear as you walk it. Way will open. While way opening can be joyous, it can also be far more challenging than anything we had imagined. It might even look like way closing. In particular, let's reflect on the past 18 months. A global pandemic, the climate emergency, rampant economic and social inequality, rising authoritarianism. Living in the midst of these challenges, I think it's fair that some of us right now, in the middle of our dark, sleepless nights, might ask, will way open? In answer to this, as Quakers, I believe we are called to help create the kingdom of God on earth. Or, as the Cuban American theologian Ada Maria Esase Diaz has called it, the kingdom of God. As I've prayed on this part of our theology, a particular way of thinking about it has taken root more deeply in my heart. Salvation for me is not an individual pursuit with reward mostly occurring beyond this existence. Salvation is a societal effort that can only be fully realized if it is realized in the eternal now of our collective being. It is the realization of kinship, of our deep interdependence through the multiplicity of our shared being. It is in the laying down of coercion and separation amongst us. It is in the letting go of the false ideas and patterns that separate us from one another and from God. It is our collective, interwoven personal journeys, our communion, as part of a world that yearns for liberation. Given this, the challenges of the past year could be viewed as a chrysalis. Whether way will open for our collective transformation is something not yet known. What I believe we as friends are called to do in this time of unknowing is surrender unto Spirit, to act faithfully, to listen, to trust, and to grow even in the face of uncertainty, even in the face of those who proclaim and sow separation. So knowing that our salvation relies upon our shared transformation, let us open our hearts and listen to one another in spirit with persistence, patience, and humility, both this week and in the months and years ahead. If we do, then we can say with a clear heart, as both reassurance to one another and as a statement of faith in our ability to walk the uncertain road before us, way will open. As we open ourselves to the kingdom this week, I'm blessed to remind you that we have an amazing series of plenary speakers to open our hearts and to transform our minds. Tara Huska, Clinton Pettis and friends, Neo Newspan, and tonight, Lisa Graustein. whom I am very honored to introduce. Lisa is a founding host of Three Rivers Meeting and New England Yearly Meeting. She taught in public schools in Boston for 20 years and now trains teachers and nonprofit staff. Lisa served for many years as staff and coordinator for the New England Yearly Meeting Young Friends program and is a co-facilitator of the Beyond Diversity 101 workshops. Lisa's current call to ministry among friends is centered on noticing, interrupting, and transforming patterns of oppression as we enact them so that we can build a more faithful, inclusive, and just religious society. Lisa will speak to us out of the silence. Please receive her words as in the spirit of ministry. Lisa, as you are moved.
Thank you, Barry. Good evening, friends. As Barry said, my name is Lisa Graustein. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a middle-aged white woman with reddish blonde shoulder-length hair, wearing a blue tank top, standing in front of a rainbow-colored quilt of squares. I'll be putting glasses on and off throughout the evening. As Barry also shared, I'm part of Three Rivers Meeting and New England Yearly Meeting, and I'm coming to you tonight from the homelands of the Wappinger and Quinnipiac, currently known as the area of Southern Connecticut. As we settle into some opening silence, I invite us to honor those whose homelands we are on. Thank you. I offer gratitude first for my elders who supported me in preparing this message and are holding all of us tonight. Ahem Corvaj, Diego Navarro, Elaine Emily, Hillary Bergen, Christina Keefe Perry, Melody Brazo, May Hasbrook, Nancy Diaz-Metz, Nora Spicer, Neonu Span, and Sarah Gant held me in prayer and helped me prepare. John Fuller recorded some of the videos I'm using tonight, and David Coletta will be eldering the videos. Diego and Christina are eldering the chat tonight, and Elaine and Melody have been holding us in prayer for quite some time. Lori Martin, Rachel Liu, and TW are here with me in person. And to all of you who are showing up and co-creating this space tonight that we share, thank you. I'm going to start with a screen share. So welcome. I want to start with this image. It's my scrap clay bucket. It is a white 5-gallon bucket, about a third full of clay. Some of the clay is mushy, some is pliable, and in the shape of little circles that got punched out of different vessels. Some of it is slip that has gotten pulled off of pots as I've been making them. There's a broken plate and a bowl that dried out and cracked in multiple places. This is where everything goes to settle and get reused. I want to start and end here tonight. Just about every piece of beautiful pottery that I have made has clay from this bucket. Life is imperfect. Change is messy. Faithfulness is complicated and involves trial and experimentation. The work before us is urgent, complex, and requires deep transformation. Everything beautiful I've ever made has this messiness of practice in its DNA. I share this image to say welcome. If you are tired, welcome. If you are feeling broken down or broken open, welcome. If you are feeling mushy, welcome. If you are holding the form of another shape than that to which you are called, welcome. If you are feeling grounded and focused, welcome. If these times leave you feeling like a messy pile of something, welcome. However you are coming to this gathering this evening, welcome. I'm a potter and have been for a long time. It's the art form that most speaks to my spirit. The movement of the wheel I find deeply meditative. I love the physicality and messiness of working with clay and water, and the full engagement of using earth, water, air, and fire to create stone-like vessels that can hold food and be beauty. Pottery gives me new ways into being with and of creation. Tonight, I'm going to use pottery as a visual metaphor for the spiritual and practical work of anti-racism, of anti-oppression, and the work of realizing, of making real the realm of God. I'll be sharing videos throughout this evening of the different steps in the process of making pottery. Because video and visual images are not accessible to everyone, I'll be describing what my hands and the clay are doing. I will also be inviting you to share briefly in the chat a few times and offering 3 short meditative exercises. Please step into these invitations or not, as is good and right for you. 2 of my elders will read some of the responses that are shared in the chat. I will also be using some PowerPoint slides, which will be available after tonight, along with the links to the people and groups that I reference. And as colleagues let us know, tonight's being recorded. One of the first Quaker concepts I learned as a child was that of the inner light. I liked it. It sounded warm, inviting. It meant I was special, you were special, and our job was to recognize each other's specialness. It meant when the world was hard or scary, I carried within me a safe nightlight, a comfort and a solace, and you do too. Over time, my sense of this inner light became more complex and took on deeper spiritual meaning. For early friends, another way to name this inward light was the seed of Christ. They understood the seed of Christ to be an immutable wholeness and holiness that could not be destroyed, broken, or taken from someone. That each of us holds the ability to receive, to share, and to be one with divinity. I know the theology of this group is wide and deep and varied. What are the words you use to describe that which is whole, holy, and sacred that resides in each one of us, to which each of us is connected? You are welcome to write your words in the chat, and our elders will read some of them out loud.
Eternal One, Beloved, the living Christ, Spirit, inward teacher, deep mystery, Mama, divine indwelling, wisdom, inner light, friend.
Oh, thank you. There are so many words to describe this because it is so big and so powerful and is accessible to us all. Tonight, I'm going to refer to this as both the seed of the divine and the seed of the spirit, as the words that feel the truest for my spiritual journey. Please continue to use the words that work best for you. Early friends also understood that we each carry within us, in the language of their day, the seed of the serpent. Referencing the biblical story of creation, the seed of the serpent refers to the ways in which the temptations of the world, of domination, of dishonesty, of oppression, of empire, of separation from God, work within us. Early friends understood this to be a fact of being human in this world, and they committed themselves to the daily task of uprooting this seed. It is a daily task because we are never fully done. I take comfort in the dailiness of it. I don't have to do everything all at once. I do have to do something all the time. Just like breathing in and out, the work of unearthing the seed of the serpent is an act, a habit of health and faithful living. Now, I really like snakes and appreciate the role they play in creation, so I want to rename the second concept early friends gave us more accurately for our times. I'm going to call this the seed of empire. Empire being the intertwining systems of power over, of domination, of separation. White supremacy, ableism, patriarchy, these are some of the systems and mindsets that come from the seed of empire. What are some of the other systems that come from the seed of empire? Again, you can write your response in the chat and our elders will read them.
Monogamy, capitalism, transphobia, entropy, xenophobia, greed, individualism, genocide, poverty, colonialism, Christian hegemony, economic inequality, fear, homophobia, disconnection, schooling as education, ageism, arrogance, war, scarcity, police, murder, patriarchy.
Woo! All right, let's take a breath out. That is a long and overwhelming list of the ways that the seed of empire shows up in the world and within us. Whew. It can feel like too much, and it is too much, and it has been too much for far too long. But we each have that first seed within us. And it is that first seed of the divine that gives me the courage, commitment, and spiritual guidance to do this daily task of addressing how we have internalized empire, how I have internalized inferiority and superiority. Believing myself to be superior denies that of the divine in others and myself. Believing myself inferior denies that of the divine within me and others. And doing either reinforces the lie to everyone around me that some people are inherently more than or inherently less than others. As seekers of the truth, it is our responsibility to dispel this lie of empire in all its forms. As a white European American, queer, cisgender, dyslexic, owning class, single parent, there are many ways I have internalized both that I am superior and inferior, that I have internalized the seed of empire and externalized it in my actions that deny humanity and divinity of other people and myself. It is my daily task to remove this seed, to dispel these lies. This is my Quaker faith and practice. So now let me use clay as a metaphor and image for what this work involves. In this video, I'm wearing blue and gray shirt under faded blue overalls splattered with clay, working in my basement studio, which is painted yellow, with metal shelving behind me and pottery tools and sketches hanging on the walls and in the background. In this video, I am standing before a wedging table of white plaster and wood, working with 12 pounds of light gray clay. Can you start the video, David? Thanks. Before I can make anything out of clay, I have to wedge the clay, a process of pushing and pulling the clay, much like kneading a loaf of bread. And this does two important things. The first is that air bubbles trapped in the clay are released. This is critical, as air bubbles can distort, crack, and destroy a vessel when it's being made. This is so critical that we'll come back to it later on. The second important thing that wedging does is to create a uniform moisture level throughout the clay. If the clay is too wet, it will flop and not hold its shape. If it is too dry, it will be stiff, hard to work, and can crack. If it is too wet in some places and too dry in other places, the clay will flop or collapse or will separate from itself. To find the seed of empire, the air bubbles, I have to work the clay. I have to touch it, feel it, and move it. And as I do this, my whole body is engaged. My hands push the clay, strengthened by the muscles in my arms, shoulders, and back. My legs and torso rock with the motion of wedging the clay. The seeking out the seed of empire requires me to be fully engaged and connected, not just with myself, but with the system with which I am working. I can't leave any part of me behind or complacent. I must be fully and completely engaged. The kind of wedging I'm doing allows me to work on a much larger mass of clay than my muscles can work as a whole. Because I work on a portion at a time and turn it, work and turn, work and turn, until I have a mass of clay that is spiraled up along itself, much like an elongated shell or the top of a steamed bun. And this is metaphor for both the dailiness of this practice we must engage in and the way that unlearning oppression works. We are never fully done, but on each successive turn, we work one small part. Expose some new way that systems of oppression work in and among us. Use each turn and rotation of learning to support the next. We are never fully done nor totally woke, but rather engaged in a lifelong process of awakening, of coming into our fuller selves as we work out and release all the ways that empire has shaped us. Tonight, I'm going to share a mix of how I'm learning to do this work of working out the seed of empire within myself and practices that we can all use in community with each other. At times, I'll be speaking from the particular experiences of the identities I hold, and other times, practices that all of us across our diverse community can use together. So I hope there's something in this for everyone. I went into teaching middle school and high school right out of college. I saw very quickly how my privileged experience of high school held so few useful reference points for me in serving my students well. There was so much I needed to learn. I attended just about every diversity workshop I could find. This was the mid-90s, and most workshops at the time asked participants to fill out a chart, listing all of our various identities in either an oppressor column or a victim column. And while we were rarely told to tally the columns, there were always some unspoken assumptions about the math of those columns. I absolutely didn't want to be oppressive. That was the whole reason I was going to these workshops in the first place. I could see ways that I was trained to act as a white person and as a white teacher that were harmful to my Black and brown students. And I knew there were many ways I was not yet seeing. I had a lot of guilt and shame, particularly around my racial and class backgrounds, but I knew that my guilt and shame were serving no one and needed to be worked through. How could I learn to be myself and not do harm to my students? And while I've experienced being victimized, a huge part of my 20s was reforming my identity as a queer woman that was not grounded in being a victim at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. I had to do the work of reforming myself and integrating all of my identities and all the ways they taught me to be in the world. And I understand this to be lifelong dual work. It's the internal work of who I know myself to be and working out the seed of empire while nurturing the seed of the spirit within me. And it's the external work of understanding how I can show up as my full self in ways that support others in showing up as their full selves. Again, working out the seed of empire among us and nurturing the seed of the divine within each of us. Like everyone else and each of you, I am whole and holy. The seed of the spirit lives in me. I have to learn and practice every day, however, to resist and dispel the seed of empire in all the complex ways that my identity impacts how that seed takes root in me. In a moment, I'm going to talk about coming out and some of my journey with being queer and how it informs my work against empire. Before I do that, I just want to take a pause and truly honor all the people for whom coming out or being seen as your full selves is not a safe or sustainable option. I pray we can make space for each of us to show up this week as we can and as we need to. One of the many gifts of queerness and coming out that I experience is the intentional self-claiming I had and have to do. I have internalized so many messages about who I am supposed to be and how I'm supposed to love that are just lies. Lies that when I tried to live within them were harmful and disastrous. The process of coming out for me is of pulling myself out from under the lies of homophobia and heteronormativity. Friend Jan Wood, in her study of the Gospels and identifying the spiritual gifts that exist in our communities, names this process of lifting out from under oppression as exorcism. This exorcism is life-giving, life-affirming, and one of the most faithful things I can do. I know that exorcism is not a word we often hear in Quaker spaces. And for those of us who have lived in other faith communities, it can have loaded, painful, and complex meanings. I find it so useful, however, to have a spiritual word for the process of lifting out from under oppression. Exorcism, in this understanding, is not something someone does to another, but rather a commitment we make to our individual internal work and our collective community work. There is so much of that work that we have to do before us. It is the work that early friends understood as the daily task of unlearning the seed of empire. So what is the exorcism that I have to do around all the ways that I've internalized white supremacy? I could talk all night about this and will spend the rest of my lifetime doing this work. For tonight, I want to share one small piece. Jan Wood is the name of the author, and you'll get links to all these folks at the end. So tonight I want to share one small piece of this. Much of how I experience white supremacy working within me centers around control. Wanting to control how I am viewed and seen by others, wanting to control situations and sometimes people, really wanting to control the narrative, particularly when it's about me, and all the ways that I've internalized the need to control my body in order to live up to the ever unattainable standards of whiteness. So part of my own exorcism of lifting myself out from under this desire for control and domination is doing the opposite. It's releasing control to spirit and being fully with my body in all the ways that it is. My Celtic ancestors, before empire, before whiteness, lived in relationship with the earth and were fully and deeply grounded in their physical, spiritual selves. Their understanding of our interconnectedness with creation and with our own capacity for spiritual growth was conceptualized as 3 cauldrons or bowls in our bodies that, when honored and aligned, supported our spiritual well-being. So if it is good and right for you, I invite you to take a moment and join me in a brief breathing and centering exercise based on this understanding of my ancestors. The first of these cauldrons or bowls is located in our pelvis and lower torso. I invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze, placing your hands on your lower belly and breathing deeply into this part of your being. Let's just take a moment and let our bellies expand fully as we inhale and sink back a little as we exhale. And as we inhale, to love this part of our body that gets so scrutinized and so shamed. To hold dear this place where we process all that we need to sustain ourselves. In the wisdom of my ancestors, this space focuses our connection to the earth, is a place of our creativity, and nurtures new ideas and leadings. As we breathe into this space, I invite all of us to feel our connection to the earth, to ground down deep, to notice what spirit is bringing into our beings. What are we being asked to hold or create this week with one another? How are we called to nurture the seed of the divine within each of us? How are we called to nurture the seed of the divine among us? Thank you. And here I'm going to return to clay as visual metaphor. So again, I'll describe the scene for a second before the video starts. In this video, and all the subsequent ones, I'm sitting on a small stool in front of my potter's wheel with only my arms, thighs, and the front of my torso visible. The wheel is silver metal. Sometimes I have a black round bat on top of it. It's surrounded by a mustard green plastic splash pan, and I have a red plastic bucket next to the wheel that I reach into for water and my yellow sponge. The next step in making a bowl is centering the clay on the wheel. This starts with trying to put the clay as close to the center of the wheel as possible. The process is then pushing the clay in and up, then down and out. Over the course of this process, the different clay particles cycle through the center of the mass of clay, coming into a form that is perfectly centered on the wheel, creating a spinning mass that is stable and balanced. While my hands and arms are doing most of the work, my whole body is still engaged. I am leaning with the weight of my torso. I'm using my thighs to brace and strengthen my arms, and my foot is controlling the speed of the wheel. My brain is organizing my body's movements, but I am not thinking. In fact, my other ways of knowing and understanding are engaged. For me, I need my spirit to be fairly grounded in order to center clay. If I'm angry or unsettled, I can't center the clay. If I am out of balance, I struggle to center the clay. And it is my sense of feel, far more than my sense of sight, that lets me know when the clay is centered. I can feel in more detail clay that is centered or uncentered than my eyes can see. And in a moment, I'm going to jump ahead in the process to show a bowl being thrown from clay that is uncentered. When clay is uncentered or off balance, it cannot maintain its integrity as the bowl grows. This bowl is wobbling all over the place. If I try to make a bowl with clay like this, one part will be much thicker and one part much thinner, eventually collapsing. When the clay is uncentered, the body cannot hold itself. And this, to me, is a metaphor for the work of anti-racism and anti-oppression among friends. When we have not done the work to address white supremacy, racism, and other forms of oppression in our communities, when some of us are regularly made to feel on the edges, from this vantage point, we can clearly see and feel how uncentered and off balance the body is. Yet when we speak it to those in the center, we are often met with confusion, resistance, and denial. To the clay in the center of an uncentered body, things look and feel fine. Yet as the wheel spins faster and faster, the denial of the reality of those on the edges increases the harm, increases the separation, increases the collapse of the whole. As a potter, I can move in and remove some of the clay on the outer edges. The body of clay might now feel more centered, unaware of what has been lost, but the vessel is no longer in its fullest form. How would the Religious Society of Friends be a fuller version of our faith if we were truly centered? If friends with a clear view of what we needed to address were fully centered, what would change? So our centering is not about cutting off parts of the body. It is about moving what has been pushed to the side into the center and moving what has been centered to another part of the body. By centering that which has not been centered, we deepen and strengthen the integrity of the whole. And just so I am super clear, in the work of anti-racism before us, this means centering the experiences of Black, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latinx, and multiracial friends, and decentering whiteness and white supremacist ways of being and doing. It does not mean that as a European American friend, I am any less a part of the whole. It means that my white notions of comfort are no longer the center around which the meeting revolves. And our faith gives us so much to do this work of recentering what needs to be centered. For many years, when invited to facilitate anti-racism workshops for different friends groups, I've used this simple exercise, and here I'll do a screen share. So we're going to make a T-chart, which is a horizontal line across the top with a vertical line in the middle. And in the top of the left-hand column, it says Quaker culture. And so I'm just going to name a few aspects of our Quaker culture. And here I'm talking very broadly as an unprogrammed East Coast friend, experience Quaker culture. Right? So back in the day, and some friends still use thee instead of you, we tend to sit in circles. We tend to not show big emotions, not have a lot of space for big emotions. And this notion that birthright friends, and I'm putting birthright in air quotes, hold or can claim more authority than convinced friends. These are some aspects of Quaker culture that I see and experience. And so I'm going to invite you in the chat. What are some other specific Quaker culture practices that you observe or participate in? And our elders will read some of them.
Conflict avoidance. Operating from the neck up. Intellectualism. Thrift, not spending our generational wealth. Using special language. Valuing silence over truth. Sticking to an agenda. Postponing courage.
Woo! All right, y'all are on fire tonight because yes, I have experienced and participated in all those aspects of our culture. So in this exercise, the next task, what I'm putting at the top of the right-hand column, is just to ask, does this cultural practice come from our faith or does it come from somewhere else? So let's take this use of thee, right? And this practice started when thee was the informal version of you and you was the formal version. Right? To me, that comes from our faith, right? It's about equality. It's about not recognizing rank. It's about saying, I can be on the same plane and space with you. So let's look at this notion of sitting in circles. Again, to me, that feels like it comes from our faith of not just our commitment to equality, but that all of us can access the spirit. All of us can minister to each other. We practice consensus. Consensus works better when we can all see each other, when we're all on the same plane. When I think about the ways that as a Quaker, I've been taught not to show big emotions, particularly if they're negative, that to me feels like it comes from white supremacy culture. And in the slide deck that will be shared later, there's a link to Tema Okun's work. She's got a new webpage talking about white supremacy culture in a lot more detail. But this notion of not showing big emotions to me is about control. That it is about controlling what might be pushing back against the existing power structure. It's controlling getting me to control myself so that I am more passive. I am more obedient to whatever is happening. And it's about dominating our bodies so that we can dominate other people's bodies. I can't commit the sin of dominating somebody else's body until I've internalized that my body is worthy of being dominated too. I have to experience that emotional disconnect of separating from myself so that when I do that harm to other people, it doesn't hurt as much. And this notion of birthright friends, right, that doesn't come from our faith at all. We don't believe that our spirituality is inherited. We don't believe it comes from genetic lineal lines. And that, again, to me, feels like white supremacy culture and a way of power hoarding, that it mirrors bigger institutions in our country that created grandfather clauses, legacy admissions, and the ways that race-based accumulated wealth can get inherited within families for generations. Right? We believe everyone can connect the spirit and anyone can minister to friends. So being a birthright friend shouldn't hold any extra value. So this exercise we could do all night. We could take each one of the things that you all named because they were powerful and true and look at where does it come from. We don't have the time to do that, but I want to share what the next steps would be, hoping that some of you will pick this up later this week. So in this next exercise, once we've looked at different pieces and where they come from, it's very simple. We center those that come from our faith and theology and stop engaging in those that don't. In the metaphor of centering clay, this is where we cut off parts of the clay. The cultural practices that do not serve us nor the divine, we end them. We stop engaging in them. And in life, of course, this is not as simple as just trimming some clay. In part because those most centered in our communities will resist and push back against the culture changes. We can have care for these friends, but we need to not center their resistance at the expense of what must be centered. The practices that are consistent with our faith and all who have been marginalized by how we have been doing things, by the ways that we manifest the seed of empire, by the ways that we have been unfaithful. In the wisdom of my ancestors, the second of these three bowls or cauldrons that resides within us sits in our rib cage. It's connected to our emotions, to processing what we're experiencing, and with water as a force that can transmute and move between. So again, if it is good and right for you, I invite you to join me in this brief practice. Close your eyes and breathe deeply so that your lungs expand your rib cage as you inhale, and you can feel it settle as you exhale. You may want to place your hand over your heart center. So let's just breathe for a moment at your own speed. Breathe deeply and fully. And as you're breathing, really notice what you are feeling. How does this idea of releasing some of our cultural practices and centering other cultural practices feel to you? How are you feeling in response to this idea of releasing some of the ways we do things to focus on those more aligned with our faith? If you visualize your heart center as holding a bowl of water, what does it look like? Is the water still? Is it churned up? Is it shallow? Is it overflowing? As a potter, throughout this whole process, I'm paying attention to the clay and my body. Pottery is about attention and stamina. Is the clay getting too wet and mushy? Too dried out and stiff? Do I need to stretch my back or massage my wrists? Let's take a moment now and do that. How is your body feeling? How do you need to move or be with what has come up so far? What do you need to tend to? If you want, you can share how you're feeling in the chat. This part we're not going to read. You can get up and stretch, get a drink of water. Just take a moment to tend to yourself. I'm going to go back to pottery as metaphor for the work before us. Once the clay is centered, I can begin to open the bowl. The theme of this gathering is "Way will open." I often hear friends use that phrase when whatever group that is just gathered has come to a stuck place in the discernment or action. Sometimes it's said as a fervent prayer, "May way open." Sometimes I hear it with some hopelessness or throwing up of hands. Well, I guess way will open somehow. Sometimes I hear it as an excuse to be passive. Way will open. We can just sit here and wait. Here, I'm placing my thumbs in the middle of a centered piece of clay and gently pressing downward. The force of the spinning clay begins to pull my fingers in and down. A centered piece of clay needs only a light touch to open into a fuller form. Slowly and with many passes, my hands gently press on one point on either side of the clay, pulling the sides of the walls up, creating a cylinder that can then be formed into other shapes. With pottery, as you've seen, I've had to do most of the work before I get to this stage of opening. the wedging and the centering, the messy, muscle-straining work of working out systems of oppression in me, of balancing what is too wet and what is too dry, of bringing myself into centered alignment, of repeatedly working to bring the edges into the center, and of moving out what was in the center to the edges. Once I have done that, I can open the clay and begin to form the bowl. But if I don't tend to these first messy, tiring steps of wedging and centering, way will not open well at all. How often do we wait for way to open without also doing the work to prepare the way to open? A few years ago, I was co-leading a multi-day racial healing workshop. As part of the workshop, I gave a presentation about the stages of genocide that I'd given a number of times before. It is hard material, but incredibly useful, and had been well received in the past. This time, however, I did not do the level of preparation, of wedging and centering that was needed. I did great harm to many of the people in the workshop. And I did this because I approached this part of the workshop as a teacher, centering my knowledge and myself, and in doing so, damaged old wounds and created new ones in the group. So I had to stop, take the clay off the wheel, and go back to the beginning. I asked one of my co-facilitators to hold a listening circle. I apologized. I worked to make amends where I could, and I committed to learning, to working through the seed of empire within me. It was messy. I had to feel all my feelings and be with all the feelings of those I had harmed. In relating this to you, I can viscerally feel the hot flash of alarm and shame I felt when the people I had harmed told me I had harmed them. And I can also feel the deep sense of gratitude I had for all those who were still willing to work with me, those who made space for their own and my holiness in the midst of the harm and the pain. I can hold the fullness of both seeds present in myself. One has never failed me. The other I am forever working to address and work through. When I am ungrounded and uncentered, when I have not wedged out the seed of empire in the clay, when I have not centered that which needs to be centered and seek to open, I can throw the whole thing off, cause harm, and wreck what I am seeking to create. And I have to go back to the start, taking each step in careful turn. Had I approached that part of the workshop seeking to create a space for healing, I would have centered the participants and the group and their needs and experiences. I would not have done the presentation as I did, and I would not have done the harm I did. And I want to pause my metaphor of clay here and speak for a moment about harm and pain. I recently experienced some homophobia from some friends I hold dear and with whom I am in many years of relationship. I was angry and hurt and acted with a directness and fierceness that is true to my nature, but not common among friends. Everyone wanted to talk about my pain. I know this has caused a lot of pain. Maybe we can talk when you're in less pain, Lisa. Or I want to give you space because you're in pain. Ugh. I believe their intentions were really good, but the impact of those words was gross feeling. I didn't like it. It felt invasive and somehow fetishizing of my pain, while simultaneously denying that these friends had caused the harm that created the pain. I found myself getting increasingly uncentered as I tried to tend to my own feelings, educate the friends who had hurt me, and hold space for healing for all of us. It was too much, so I had to step way back from many of the ways that I engage with this group of friends so that I could tend to my own feelings and healing. I'm using this time apart to also really look at all the ways that I'm colluding with different systems of oppression within my faith community. I'm taking time to really look at all the ways I've internalized that I have to absorb the harm in order for others to learn or to help the body move forward. How have I internalized the seed of empire? How can I most honor the seed of the divine? So as we step into this week with each other and with what it means to grow into an anti-racist faith community, let's remember this. Harm is a thing that happens between people, something we play a part in. We can either collude with it or we can interrupt it and work to heal it. But we must stop the harm before we can heal the pain. We must interrupt the ways we recreate white supremacy and racism among us so that we can tend to each other fully as Spirit invites us to. So back to clay and metaphor and those air bubbles I said I'd talk more about. I've done the work to re-wedge the clay and center it. I've opened the clay and I'm starting to shape the bowl. Here I'm using a small yellow sponge held in my right hand on the outside of the clay and the fingers of my left hand on the inside. I'm applying pressure on a focus point that moves up the side of the growing bowl. This thins the clay, and each pass of my hand stretches the clay up and out. Every part of the clay is touched in turn. No part of the bowl can grow without impacting the rest of the vessel. All of it must be worked in order to grow into a new shape. I'm using a tool, the sponge, to support this work of growth and expansion. The tool is soft and smooth, and I can make it firm with my hand. At times, as the clay is shifting, the growing bowl wobbles a bit. But if I am patient and pay attention and address each part in turn, the centeredness of the clay can be regained. This work is a process that takes time and attention. If I missed air bubbles in my wedge, or if my wedging was incomplete, I'll start to feel them as little bumps inside my growing bowl. As the clay thins and moves, the air trapped inside pushes out, making itself known and felt. It formed bumps and puffed out shapes along the wall of the growing bowl. I can feel them before I can see them. My whole body is paying attention to the sensation of my fingertips and what I am feeling is happening. If I don't tend to them, they will crack the wall of the bowl. Or, if they remain, when the bowl is fired in the kiln, the air will expand and explode the bowl, destroying it and everything around it in the kiln. When we leave harm untended, when we don't address the ways that systems of oppression are operating among us and our faith community, we allow fissures and fault lines to form, or things come to a point where deep and lasting harm is done. So again, I'm going to go back to clay as metaphor. So here, there are air bubbles. They're small. I can address them. To do that, I stop the wheel from spinning. I slow the process way down. I take a pause. I use my pin tool to release the air trapped in the clay. I make space for that which has been stuck, unseen, or unacknowledged to be seen, addressed, and for things to be released and enter into a new state of being. But then I have to repair. There's now less clay in these spots and it is weaker. The whole vessel is weaker until it has been restored. So I start the wheel back up, and on the next few pulls of my finger over the clay, I'm paying particular attention to these spots, easing clay back into the spaces where there was air, noticing with minute attention what the clay can hold and do, working slowly and consciously until I can feel the strength of the body in these places and overall return. I work until there is full repair and integrity, not just in that one spot, but across the whole body. I tend to what needs to be tended. If the air bubble is too big, or I let it go untended for too long, the integrity of the clay will falter and the bowl will collapse, and I must go back to the wedging table and begin again. And in pottery, nothing is wasted. I take the collapsed vessel and re-wedge the clay and begin again. There is no shame in needing to go back and attend to the beginning steps. So how do we do this in life with each other when it's not as simple as stopping the wheel? The first step is to notice the air bubbles as they begin to become apparent. In New England Yearly Meeting, we've been doing this at our annual sessions for nearly 3 years now. We use a practice of noticing patterns that I learned from friend Neonu Span, who will be speaking and singing to us on Wednesday night. In New England, our Noticing Patterns of Oppression and Faithfulness working group is tasked with engaging friends in noticing and naming when we see patterns of oppression being enacted among us and when we see patterns of faithfulness among us. Noticing patterns of oppression can mean pausing business meeting to lift up how something that just happened denies some of us our humanity and divinity. How a statement about the budget or a hiring policy carries with it implicit assumptions about race, class, ability, sexual orientation, or privileged access to some resources. Noticing faithfulness means pausing to honor how someone just invited us into deeper spiritual wholeness with their vulnerability, their truth speaking, or a radical act of compassion. Or it might mean taking a moment to pause and recognize when we have collectively interrupted a pattern of oppression and begun that process I was talking about earlier of engaging in cultural practices that are grounded in our beliefs, that allow us to realize spirit among us. It means disrupting the status quo and calling each other into the life and truth the divine offers us, and that we have the capacity to offer each other. Some friends have expressed concern that interrupting and naming this way will cause harm. And if it's done to shame people or with an air of superiority, it can cause harm. But the harm is already in the room. Staying silent when harm is happening is not okay. In the past few weeks, I have been both the one who witnessed harm and stayed silent, and the one who was being harmed while others stayed silent. Both moments sit heavy in me. The weight of this lack of faithfulness is palpable and has real impact. It erodes the integrity of our community. And there are friends on this Zoom tonight who are part of both those instances. We are messy and messing up, and we are whole and holy. We have the seed of the Spirit in us, and we can use it to address the seed of the empire among us. This is messy, hard, complicated work. We don't always get it right, but we are learning and growing together, and it's beginning to transform how we are with each other in New England Yearly Meeting. At the center of this work is our faith that each of us holds the capacity to feel when harm is happening and to feel when faithfulness is present, that the seed of the Spirit exists in each of us and that we can tap into it at any time. For me, this sits most primarily in my body. There are things my brain and heart can recognize and articulate as harm, and then there are those moments when something has happened and I can feel the offness about what is happening, but I don't have the words for it. This often feels like a drop in my stomach, a tightening throughout my muscles, or feeling the blood drain from my extremities to my core. These are all survival responses. I may not intellectually have the words for the complex social dynamic that is playing out, and I may not even be in direct danger myself, but my body knows that something unsafe or harmful is happening. My spirit responds. And in those moments, we don't have to have all the words or everything figured out to say, wait. I just felt my stomach drop and I got really anxious. What happened? With that interruption, I am describing what I'm experiencing and inviting others to help me understand what is going on. Together, we can name what has happened and work to find a new way to move forward that does not cause harm. When we turn our attention to the edges and recenter what has been untended. Similarly, when I am witnessing great faithfulness, I often feel that as an expansion throughout my body, as a leaning in and opening up, as a free flowing of tears. And again, I don't always know or understand all that is happening, but I can feel it. My being knows and recognizes the amplification of the seed of the Spirit in that moment. And in New England Yearly Meeting, we use 5 sentence prompts to invite this noticing and naming. So I'm going to move to a screen share here to share them with you. And again, they'll be available afterwards. So the 5 prompts are, I feel, and this can be an emotion or a physical sensation that I'm sharing, that I'm feeling. I see, what I'm physically seeing in front of me, or what I'm seeing play out on a conceptual level or a pattern level. I hear the words we're saying or the implicit assumptions unspoken underneath those words. I wonder when I'm not sure and I want to test something, and I know. And this knowing is less intellectual knowing and more spirit heart knowing. And I've put these prompts around the drawing of a tree because when we do this noticing, we're naming the branches to help us get at the roots of what's going on. I alone can name and notice some pieces. You can name and notice some pieces. When we invite everyone into this practice, we can see the fullness of what's happening. We can nourish the roots we want to nourish, and we can address the ones that we need to address. So again, in the chat, if you want, and our elders will read some of these, pick a prompt and write your sentence. Share what you are noticing. Let us take a moment and be with wherever we each are.
I feel Lisa's open and loving heart. I feel grateful. I feel cared for. Relief and excitement. I feel Lisa's truth. I feel scared to start naming. I feel lightness. I'm noticing a fluttery feeling in my chest of celebration. I hear pain and want to acknowledge it. I know I'm in the right place. I feel hope. I feel the vulnerability and energy and truth-telling. I feel clarity moving towards possibility. I feel a deep connection to all listening.
Thank you. Thank you, friends.
And I want to be clear, this practice of noticing, there are friends among us who've been doing this for centuries. Sometimes we listen to them, often we haven't. What's different here is that this practice is a collective commitment to invite the noticing, to receive the noticing, and to center that which is being noticed. The fear is real, and some friends have been expressing this noticing again for decades and have been shunned and ostracized for it. So stepping into this practice is not as simple as just saying things. It's making the inward commitment and the outward expressions to hold that noticing, to honor it, and to tend to it and address it. Before we close tonight, I want to share one more example of what it can look like when we do the work of faithfulness, of anti-racism, of anti-oppression in our meetings. I'm part of starting a new meeting, Three Rivers Meeting, which is an open and affirming Christian Quaker experience of worship and connection, seeking to reclaim and reimagine Quaker practices for this time. We are an unapologetically queer community that tries to practice radical hospitality, welcoming diverse theologies and identities. This is a Christian meeting inclusive enough that as a Universalist friend, I feel most at home and held. In worship a few months ago, the first two messages both used the metaphor of light good, dark bad. In the context of that time and place, in the bigger context of our nation, the messages were using imagery grounded in white supremacy. Christina, who had care of meeting, interrupted meeting for worship, named what was happening, and invited friends to use different metaphors. And here's what happened. The body held this. The next three messages used non-racist images and metaphors. When we ended worship and shifted to fellowship, friends shared gratitude for Christina's intervention. One of the friends who'd given one of the first two messages expressed appreciation for the eldering. And the receiving of the eldering was able to happen for two main reasons. The first was that as a white person, Christina knew that those friends most impacted by racist metaphors shouldn't have to be the ones to speak up or absorb the harm of those metaphors going unaddressed. She was grounded, clear, and direct. She was holding the whole and all the parts. Christina believed that supporting friends in interrupting harm was a clear way to express her love and care for everyone. the best way she could hold care of meeting. And the other reason this was able to happen was that we as a meeting had been doing the work to create the vessel in which this could happen. We are explicit about the kind of Quaker worship space we are trying to create. We are committed to valuing Quaker faith and practice over mainstream culture and maintaining the comfort of those privileged by it. We work to be transparent about our evolving processes and practices. We dig in and support each other. We care about tending to harm, and we know that paying attention to harm and attending to it is itself a great act of faithfulness. And we're okay with being messy and imperfect. We experiment, we try different things out, and many times one of us has changed up the plan for our semi-programmed worship in the moment because we're listening to Spirit, and we trust each other to follow that guidance. We center the seed of the Spirit and those gathered, not the plan or the ego of those leading. We are blessed to only have 15 months of this way of doing things and not years or centuries of precedent to contend with. We are seeking to create a worship space and Quaker culture based on our faith, active in addressing the seed of empire and all the ways it shows up. We base our actions and decisions in nurturing the seed of the Spirit. Before I end with some silence and questions for us to hold, I want to return to that meditative practice of my ancestors. So again, if it's good and right for you, please join me. The third bowl or cauldron in their understanding sits and resides in our skulls. And this one is associated with spiritual connection, with cultural wisdom and maturity, and the element of air. So again, I invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze, to breathe deeply and fully, first into our bellies, into our grounding in the earth, then into our ribs, expanding fully, into our feelings, and then to consciously connect these two parts of our being with the crown of our heads, to consciously welcome in Spirit more fully, to be with our bodies, to invite our Quaker ancestors who have gone before us and have wisdom to offer us to guide us this week, and to ask Spirit to help us make good choices for those that come after us. In the wisdom of my ancestors, these three bowls or cauldrons could be in an upright and open position. They could be tilted on their sides, or they could be upside down. Our spiritual well-being was a result of them being in their upright form and able to hold their full purpose. My ancestors believed that the way to right these bowls when they were sideways or upside down was through fully embodied living, through the process of feeling fully, both the joyous feelings and the hard ones. This was a living not of suppression and denial, but of fully embodied presence. And I understand this to be how many early friends lived too, and how we came to have our name. We literally shook with the Spirit. We were so embodied that the Spirit moved us. And we felt the sufferings of the ways that the seeds of empire separate us from Spirit, from each other, and from divine love. So just to review for a moment what I have shared tonight. Where are we as individuals and as friends communities? Are we at the stage of wedging, of forming the whole, working out the seed of empire, working on the interconnected systems of oppression, centering, bringing into wholeness, tending into harm and misalignment, centering that which has not been centered, opening, making space for life and spirit, shaping, holding space for us all? Or do we need to renew and go back and rework what has been there? As we move into this week, what are the Quaker spaces we are called to create? What must be centered? What must be released? What must be repaired? What are the forms of transformation and change that we already know? And I'm going to close with this image that I started with of my clay scrap bucket, because in pottery, nothing is wasted. The pieces that fall apart, that I break, that come off, they go back to the body to be remade anew. Nothing is wasted. No effort is failed. There is no shame in needing to go back to the beginning. The seed of the divine is whole and holy within each of us. Our daily task, our daily act of faithfulness, is to address that which denies our own and each other's humanity and divinity, so that together we can bring the realm of the divine here and now. Thank you, friends. It is a blessing to be among you.